So yesterday I was out of town in the Columbia area, and I took the opportunity to stop by a shoe store that, special shoe fittings, and I had a coupon for them, so I was going to use that. And I took the opportunity to get, that particular store scans your feet and does all these cool things. And as we're waiting for some stuff, my wife takes the opportunity to make fun of the way I run to the shoe sales lady. And she describes my weird gait and how I run and all this stuff. And what comes out of my mouth is, well, I'm faster than you. But so that goes down a little bit. And my son, he reminds us that he needs new shoes, and he thinks it'd be really cool. And I'm like, okay, you can get your feet scanned too and see that. And of course, we're in a running store. So the first thing he does when he tries one of these new shoes, he starts running. And it looks exactly like what my wife just described is how my run looks. She goes, well, we see where it came from. And so apparently my son runs like me, which is kind of scary because I saw him run. But there's a lot about him, though, that isn't just running. Like he walks a lot like me, does a whole lot of things like me. And it's not just in the movements I do, it's in the character I have, too. My children, all three in different ways, are very similar to a mixture of both me and Tracy and some of their own uniqueness, and it's really cool to see. But the question in that is who do you walk like, or run like, if you want to go there? Who do you take steps like? Not just in your gait, but in how you actually walk in life, not just in the way you physically move, but in what you do and how you act and what you say. Because in today's story, we're going to see that potentially the only difference between salvation and condemnation is whether or not you try to walk like God. It's like the only clue we get in the story is that this man who walks with God, he is spared from condemnation. Do you walk like Jesus if he were in your shoes? So today we're going to cover what is one of the most famous stories in all of humanity, not just the Bible. It is the Great Flood. At least half of all ancient cultures have a story like it. Nearly every children's storybook Bible has it. It's one of those things, like the children's storybook Bibles, they're not the Bible. I don't know why we call them Bible, but they're stories from the Bible. And they have like 10 to 30 stories in them. All of them have this story in there. Children's nurseries get painted with this story in it. Although I do think it's a strange thing that we depict mass genocide on the walls of children's nurseries. But we go for the pictures of the animals, not the rest of the story, I guess, though, there. But nearly every person with exposure to the Bible knows the story of Noah and the ark. They just do. To prove our familiarity with the story, I can ask you all a question. How many animals did Moses take on the ark? He said none. Do you agree? Yeah. Okay, good. You caught it. Moses didn't build an ark, right? But how many animals did Noah take on the ark? How many of each kind? This is where you get confused, right? How many of each unclean animal? Unclean is 2 of each. Clean animals, he's instructed to take how many? It's actually 7 pairs. It's kind of weird, and most English translations don't get it. So it's 14 of every clean animal he's supposed to take. And so, yeah. But still, your brains are working. You are ready for that question, too. You've been exposed to the story of Noah and the ark, right? But then also in that, I bring up those details of like how many animals, and there's the extra detail of how many clean animals versus unclean animals, to say that there are actually a whole lot of details in this story. In fact, it is one of the most detailed stories in the entire Bible. It has the highest level of chronological details of literally any story in the Bible. There is no other story in the Bible that has as many details of time frame that this one does. And so that's the crazy amount of one. So there's the details of how many animals to bring. There's the details of how many dates to bring. There's so many details, in fact, that you can cut half of the story out and still get a coherent story. This was actually a weird assignment by a professor that I had in my first graduate program, that he did it for wrong reasons because he was a horrible person who was trying to get students not to believe in the Bible. But and it was a Master Divinity program, weird thing. But the assignment was every time that the word Elohim, or God, is used, put that in this column. And every time a sentence uses the word the Lord or Yahweh, put it in this column. And you can actually do that. And every sentence that has God and every sentence that has the Lord, you can separate out, and it is two completely coherent stories with no missing details about the overall flood narrative. It's a highly crafted, highly detailed, so much there are literally double the amount of details you need to get a coherent story in the story of Noah and the ark. And so it's far from just a kid's story. For one, there's all the death in it, right? So that's, it's okay to expose children to the reality of the world, but it's also a foundational story for all of humanity. And the meaning that we get when we slow down and don't just read the 30-word version in the kids' Bible, but the over 2,300-word version in most translations, when you read through the full thing, is that you see that God is a just God, and therefore he is a judgmental God. And that's okay to say God is judgmental. He's actually the only one with the authority to be so judgmental. In spite of his righteous wrath, he also makes a promise in the middle of it all, and that is that God remembers those who walk with him. The entire world could come deluging down, and everything you know and love is swept away, but God remembers those who walk with him. Now, I'll start reading the story now. We will skip around. We are not going to even cover chapter 9 this week. I'm going to save all of that for next week's sermon time. That's the conclusion, and that's the postscript to the story of Noah and the ark. But we will at least cover the details of chapters 6, 7, and 8. And so Genesis 6, I'll start reading in verse 9 to begin. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. And we'll stop there for now. The starting phrase, these are the generations of, I've mentioned that in the previous sermon going through the book of Genesis. That is an indicator that no matter what we thought about the weirdness of the Nephilim sermon last week, we've turned the page. We can have a clean slate where we're all like, okay, it's like a palate cleanser of these are the generations of. It's okay, now new context kind of thing. Even though context matters of whatever came before, but still we're in a new story now. And the first thing we're told in this story is that Noah is a righteous man, blameless in his generation. He walked with God. And I don't think you appreciate the seriousness of how great of a compliment that is. No one gets that. Job gets almost the same wording, but not as good. And so Noah is, right off the bat, described here as better than Job. Throughout the Bible, no one is blameless and righteous at all, except Jesus. And here we get introduced to the character of Noah as, oh yeah, he's blameless and righteous. He walks with God. Like Enoch kind of maybe is, maybe. We know he walks with God. That's all the details we get about him. It does make more sense when you think about Noah compared to how we see the kings of Israel and Judah described when you get into the history books of the Bible. And their righteousness and walks with God is not used as like, were they perfect or not? It's used as, well, did he at least make an effort? And that is the standard of righteousness for the kings of Judah and Israel, is did they put forth any effort to follow the Lord? And there's several kings listed as, yeah, they were good. And then it goes through and lists off all the things they did wrong. But it'd be like, but at least they tried. And that's the standard for being a righteous king in Israel. That shows you how bad of a pool they're working with, because everyone's human, right? The only good character in the entire Bible is Jesus. And Noah, we'll get to the end that he actually is not the greatest person too. The first thing he does when he gets off the boat is gets completely wasted, right? So that's probably not a good moral guide for you there, right? Although he did just see the death of the entire earth, so I don't know what my feelings would be in his shoes, right? But it makes more sense. It's not that he's perfect, it's that an attempt is actually made. He is righteous and blameless because he's trying to follow God in a world that is completely evil. And so he's making an effort, is what it seems like is going on here. This is likely, therefore, similar to what the New Testament tries to describe what faith is like. It's not whether or not you are a perfect disciple. It's about where your loyalty lies. Are you loyal to God? And therefore, even if you don't do a great job, you're still at least loyal to him. You're trying to follow after him. And so, like a few kings, and maybe like Enoch, we do see Noah walks with God. That's really the only details we get, is that he's blameless, righteous, which compared to how the Bible describes that throughout the rest is he's making an effort, and he walks with the Lord. And we're probably supposed to think more about Adam than about Enoch, though. Noah is kind of an Adam 2.0 as you read through these stories. Now, we usually think with the New Testament that Jesus is Adam 2.0, which that's true. Jesus is the new type of man that we can follow after. But in just the book of Genesis, the flood narratives are kind of like a redo of the creation story. God resets everything and rebuilds the world. So as Adam once walked with God, Noah does too. In fact, the order of things re-emerging after the flood story happens, like in the second half of the flood story, as things come back out, they actually parallel the order of the 6 days of creation, the different things that are mentioned. And so it is supposed to be thought of as like, oh, God's resetting things here. But because we know how the history of the story works, right, there's a sad parallel coming. And we're reminded of the garden. What else happened in the garden besides creation and mankind and things like that? The fall. And so as we're reminded of, yes, okay, good creation turns bad, we get that reminder too, that there's a creation that turns bad in this story as well. Right before we get to anything that happens to Noah, we're still thinking of his righteousness. We should be like, whoa, a guy just got called righteous and blameless. Wow. And the very next sentence is, oh, and by the way, everyone's terrible. That's how the story goes there. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. In fact, we can see a contrast in the righteousness and failure if we compare two similar lines from chapter 1 and what we just read. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, compared to Genesis 6:12, it says, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good." The opposite, "And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth." A lot of the same verbiage is used there. So God saw that it was good, and by the way, he saw that it was bad. Humanity has come a long way, and not in the good direction. Like that's what we're seeing here. God has decided, therefore, to judge all humanity and the earth. He will hit a giant reset button on everything. And this tends to make some people upset with God. There's a book I'm reading now that's trying to depict God as a monster, and this is one of the similar types of passages that it uses. It's not a good book. It's extremely blasphemous. But it's trying to paint, some people get like, well, God killed people. That means he's bad, right? No, actually, God would be a monster if he did nothing about violence and sin. If he's the only one who actually knows the intention of your heart, and he knows the intention of your heart is to go hurt someone, wouldn't he be a jerk if he didn't stop you? Like, that's what's going on here. A wicked, evil judge lets a criminal go free, especially if that judge knows the future and knows the criminal will do worse as soon as he gets out. So, God stopping the life of someone can actually be a loving, good thing in the long run. Thankfully, Noah, because of his righteousness, he is selected to preserve both humanity and the animal kingdom. He is commanded to go build an ark of gopher wood and waterproof it. Now, there are two quirks in that. First, we have no idea what gopher wood is. You'll see cypress wood in some English translations, some other guesses. It's just an outrageously rare Hebrew word, so it's insert specific type of wood. But we just don't know what that type of wood is. We just don't. It's not used often enough in any text ever for us to know exactly what type of wood it is. Second, the word ark may remind you of the Ark of the Covenant, but that's not the same word in the Hebrew. Both words, this ark of the boat and the Ark of the Covenant, they both come to us in English through the Middle English Germanic way of saying box, which is ark. And so they both are box-ish shaped, and so that's how we get those words. But in the Hebrew, though, they're two separate words. This word for ark is uniquely only used here and one other passage of the Bible, and that is when Moses, little baby Moses, is put in the water inside of an ark. Now, that's the only other time used, and so that's kind of a throwback to this ark, too. And so Moses is seen as like, oh, yeah, he's kind of doing He's doing the thing the patriarchs did, is kind of what you're supposed to think through there. So there, Moses parallels Noah's story. God used an ark to save Noah through the waters of his judgment. So too, God uses an ark to save Moses through the waters of Pharaoh's evil, similarly to how we are told that we can be saved through an ark through the waters of baptism in the New Testament. 1 Peter 3:21. It compares the metaphors there. We can be saved through both God's judgment and the world's evil, through the water in that way. Over the next few verses in Genesis, though, God tells Moses how to build an ark, and those are more of the, wow, this story gets really detailed. This story goes through and tells us the dimensions of the ark. It is roughly, it's given in cubits, but cubits is about 1.5 feet. So it's roughly 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet high. And so, look to the top, the highest point of this roof, double that is the height of the ark. Look to the width of this room, a few feet further in is the width of the ark. And then from this back wall to the end of the parking lot, the far end of the parking lot, is the length of the ark. And so it's the dimensions of like a skinny, long cruise ship is what it is. Just a really small cruise ship. I like cruising on massive ships that would dwarf that, right? That would just make that boat look tiny. But I don't think we realize just how big that boat is compared to anything in the ancient world. It's massive. The first big boat we have in artwork is from approximately 2500 BC. It's the only one for the next 1,000 years. It's not until the 1500s BC that we get any details or descriptions ever of anything longer than about 100 feet. And so that this boat could even be imagined is actually some credence to the story, because no one would have thought, why would you make a boat that big? They never sailed further away than a coastline. You would always be able to see your coastline back in that day and age. Because if you go further than that, you're going to die, because they didn't have methods of sailing back then. And so any large boat made to be away from land is very unique. And this is a very big boat. So that's just it gives some credence to the idea that the fact that they could imagine this thing means that maybe it came from somewhere. Now contrast that to the Atrahasis epic. The Atrahasis epic includes a flood story, but that boat is made of reeds, which means it's not very big. It doesn't give us the dimensions of that boat, but it's made of reeds. Contrast that to the Gilgamesh epic. The Gilgamesh epic actually does have a big boat. It's 180 by 180 by 180 feet. But you know how well a cube handles the water? Not very well. And interestingly, in the Gilgamesh epic, the guy, Utnapishtim, is the guy who sails the boat, not Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the hero of that story, but Utnapishtim is the hero of the flood account within the Gilgamesh epic. Utnapishtim has a co-pilot who sails the boat and navigates and drives the boat for him in a cube. So that's just weird there. In fact, that's actually a good time to bring up these ancient flood stories. Ancient cultures, yeah, they've got several flood stories. About half of all ancient cultures have a flood story of some kind. There are two worth noting, the Atrahasis and the Gilgamesh epics, because number one, they're from next door neighbor cultures. And so these are the same stories you would have heard around the campfire. As you know on the ark, you would have heard the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh epic probably too, because they're literally your next door neighbors. If you ever interact, do any trading with any of the cultures that are the closest for you to get to, then you would have heard these stories likely too. And then also, they have extremely similar details in some of it. The Atrahasis epic, it's an 18th century Akkadian story found on clay tablets. It includes a creation story, it includes the creation of humans, it includes a flood. There's the Gilgamesh epic, which is maybe an early 3rd millennium collection of Sumerian stories and Akkadian, potentially as Sumerian, but really we just have the Akkadian versions, which are 1,000 years newer. But it's mostly just a fruitless story of the human search for eternal life, and doesn't it stink when we can't get it? That's the Gilgamesh epic there. But it includes a bit about a great flood that wipes out most of humanity. Now, I briefly mentioned some of the comparison and contrast several weeks ago when we were in Genesis chapter 1. Here we get to address more because those ancient epics do share a lot of details with the biblical flood. In all three, a powerful God decides to wipe out rebellious humanity. One person is warned about it, and he is told to build a boat to save humanity and animals. In all three accounts, extremely similar keywords are used to describe how the boat is shut, how the rains and floods come, and the subsequent destruction and receding of the waters. Extremely similar wording. If you pick and choose just one phrase at a time, you can get nearly identical word-for-word phrases in some of the spots. In all three accounts, the hero lets out birds to determine where there is land. He then exits the ark, he offers a sacrifice, and the gods of the story smell it and they bless the man. It happens in all three of the ancient stories from right around the ancient Near East there. That's a lot of overlap, and it scares some Christians depending on how it is presented. If a jerk wants to present it in order to try to discredit your faith, they can do it pretty decently if you're not ready for that. It's like, oh, wow, you mean like there's other stories out there that are similar to Genesis? I don't know why that scares us, though. But the way it's worded to some people is meant to be scary, and usually we like parallel people's emotions, and they can manipulate you for fun. But there's also a lot of chunks, basically the whole stories besides the main plot points that I mentioned, where they're not similar at all. In the Bible, God purposefully floods the earth because of humanity's descent into sins. In the myths, humans are targeted because they're too annoying. It's not that they're evil, it's they're really loud. Can we shut them up? Like, that's what goes on in the myths. In the Bible story, God stays in control. In the Gilgamesh epic in particular, the flood gets so out of control that the gods start to panic and they head for the hills too. In the Bible, the God of the Bible purposefully saves Noah because he wants to preserve humanity. In the myths, it's warring gods preserve humanity. So there's the God who's going to flood. The other God catches wind of it, goes and tells the hero of the story and says, hey, by the way, you're all going to die. You should save a boat because I like you. And they have to lie to the other God to make sure he doesn't kill this guy while he's building a boat. They have to be secretive and hidden about it. And so it's a war amongst the gods kind of thing there. In the pagan mythology, one epic saves the king. The other epic, the guy who survives becomes immortal. He's the one with the secret to immortality in the Gilgamesh epic. But in the Bible, Noah's just a regular dude to whom God shows grace. That's it. It's not because he's powerful or mighty or godlike or anything like that. In fact, we mentioned the people who've got like divine-ish characteristics in the preceding paragraphs, and they're not good guys. And so Noah's just a regular guy. He's just righteous, and he walks with God. In fact, the one good description we have of Noah, literally the only detail we get about his character and lifestyle is that he's got one wife, not a bunch. That's the only moral characteristic we have about Noah. And so that means he's not like a king, because all the kings of ancient times took as many wives as they could rule over. And so that's how it worked back then. And so Noah is such a normal guy. He's just a man who's shown grace. He doesn't even get a line in the story, right? In the Noah and the Ark story, Noah doesn't talk until the postscript when everything is done. God's the main character of the story. In the myths, powerful humans who trick and war against each other and things like that, they're the characters. They're the main characters of the story. It's like, what can we do? How cool are humans? How can we do these things? So the one God is the main character of the biblical story. He's the only character there. The final difference is the funny kicker. All three stories, yeah, they end in the hero of the story, hero in quotes, performing an animal sacrifice. In the epics, the gods start fighting each other because they are starving, because now there's not enough humans to sacrifice meat to them to go around. And the description in the Gilgamesh epic is actually they swarm the carcass of the offering like flies. In the biblical story, God smells it and says, good job, Noah. And that's the end. He doesn't have to eat it because God doesn't need sacrifice to survive because he's God. So there's a huge difference there in the ending of the stories there. And so when we get those weird details side by side, it's not something that should make us go, oh no, the Bible copied the pagans. I guess we should just pack it up and go home. Like, we don't need to that's not a good takeaway. Instead, it should make us go, oh wow, even some ancient cultures got some of the details right. Isn't that cool that they bear witness to some truth? And what about the details they get wrong? Wow. Isn't it amazing we learn that the God of the Bible is in control, knows what he's doing, doesn't need humanity, and yet preserves humanity and moves powerfully in judgment? That's more of what we should come away with when we compare the two stories there. And so one of the purposes of the flood stories is to actually critique the bad take that ancient cultures had. That's one of the purposes of it. And so the flood is actually, in many ways, an anti-idolatry polemic in which the one true God is Lord of all, not these other terrible gods that you've heard of that could barely even figure out how to build a boat, at best, and then have to require human sacrifice to them so they can survive. Like, my God doesn't need to eat what I give him. God's better than that. The story is not just told, though, to correct the errors in how other ancient cultures tell the story. Now, the similar details do tell us that the God-inspired author maybe either knew of or had read of or heard of the other versions. I get, when I read Genesis, I think of telling these stories around a campfire. That's the mindset I get, is a lot of them are perfect for that kind of thing. And so you probably heard some of these other similar stories floating around, but because those other stories exist, because this story is so filled with detail, because the story is crafted as you start paying attention to it, that means the way it was written down and crafted, inspired by the Holy Spirit, was done so for a reason. The biblical author could have just said, yep, that happened, and corrected some of the details and went home. Instead, we get like this really crafted, highly detailed, put down for a specific way, for specific reasons type of story. And so you have to ask, okay, so what is unique about this story? How is it specifically crafted? Because that then will give us clues in what the God-inspired meaning should be. Now, I've already said the story has a whole lot of details. There are enough verses. We are not going to read through all of them today. I highly recommend you do. Just we're not going to read all the verses. The full flood story, as I said, in the English translation I use is like about 2,300 words. And so that's a decent paper, right? But with all the details here, there's a fun thing we might notice when we study the story. And this is when I get to use the word penultimate a lot, right? But because there's a difference between reading a story and studying a story. I hope you know that. Like, we read the Bible a lot. How often do we study the Bible? Because there is a difference there. And when you study, that's when you start to look for quirks, and you look for repeated things, and you look for what words mean, and you start getting out other resources besides just the Bible itself to figure out how things should be written. And when you start to do that, you notice this entire story is a giant chiasm. Sometimes also called a chiasmus. It's also called a palistrophe. A chiasm is when all the details repeat or mirror each other. And often there will be one central idea in the middle that is not mirrored. And so the first idea is mirrored with the ultimate idea. The second idea is mirrored with the penultimate idea. Third idea is mirrored with the anti-penultimate idea. Fourth, pre-anti-penultimate. Fifth, pro-pre-anti-penultimate. Sixth, there's not a word for sixth to last, but it goes down like that. And so that's how it works. So here's some of the details. I'm sure you can read them all because they're nice, big, large print. So that's the whole flood story. Noah, then his 3 sons, then the ark's to be built. Go back to the bottom. Noah, second to last detail, his 3 sons. Next detail, the ark to be built. And so every idea is mirrored in reverse. Now, if that's way too many details, I know. So here's less details here. Genesis 7:4 says there are 7 days left until rain. Then we get 7 days left until rain. Then we get 40 days of rain. Then 150 days of water prevailing. Then the story flips and we start getting the reverse of everything. There's 150 days of water receding. There's 40 days before Noah sends out birds. There's 7 days before he sends out birds again, and then 7 days before sending out a bird again. And so just with the amount of days between each thing, you can see there that the story sort of mirrors itself, just with the chunk of days we're talking about between each section there. And so what's in the middle there? Because in the middle, when it flips, there's 150 days of water prevailing and 150 days of water receding. So what is the middle central point? Because a chiasm is supposed to focus your attention to the central point, because it's literally, when you write it down, it can look like an arrow. And so what is the central point that it's focusing towards? Let's find out. I'll read Genesis 7:22 through 8:4. And so the beginning will have that 150 days. The end will have that 150 days. We got to figure out what's in the middle. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. But God remembered Noah, and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. If there are too many words there, I'll give you a clue. It's chapter 8, verse 1. This is that verse. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. That is the only idea that doesn't have a parallel anywhere in the story. Which you might think, oh, it's not repeated, it's not as important. No, the fact that literally everything else is repeated means this one's the most important. And that's how Hebrew poetry works, is with chiastic structures there. I also think it's interesting that God remembered Noah is the central idea, when one of the pagan ancient myths is that the gods didn't even know their hero was on a boat at all. And yet the central idea of the biblical story is, yeah, God's watching him. And so that's a big difference there. Now, the fact that that is the focal point gives us some important reminders. First, it means that if you're going to argue about anything in the story, it should be about what that line means, not about the size of the flood or anything like that. Since people do use this passage to argue about the size of the flood, though, I'll enter into the ring. And we got 2 minutes left of the service. So first I'll state I don't have a dog in the fight. Like, I do think it's safe to assume that whatever the Bible says is true, and that's how I roll. So whatever the Bible is teaching, that's what I want to believe. I'll firstly state that. I just have to make sure that what I think the Bible is teaching is actually what it's teaching before I go and punch somebody out over it. So that's important. On most passages, that's fairly easy. On this passage, it seems pretty easy, right? I do think a decent case can be made for some wiggle room, though. We get a clue that maybe we should hold details loosely when there are things like the word earth. In the first paragraph of chapter 8, there the whole earth is still covered, and yet we get told that the mountains are not covered in that one sentence. And so that gives us a clue that sometimes there's some wiggle room and some playroom in the words. In fact, the wiggle room can be found when we talked about how the story is crafted and the words used in the story. For example, the word earth in Hebrew is eretz. That is the same exact word used for the word land. Land and earth are the exact same word in Hebrew. They don't have a different word for it. And so, anytime it talks about the whole earth, it could be saying the whole land, which in English is a big interpretive difference, right? In Hebrew, though, it's the same word. And so that's weird there. Also, the whole or the entire or all in Hebrew thought is almost always hyperbolic, which means exaggerated there. For example, just in this story alone, God goes around saying, I'm going to wipe out everyone on the face of the earth. By the way, Noah, you aren't going to be wiped out, which means all doesn't include all, because it doesn't include Noah and his family, or else God would be lying. But God's not lying, therefore all at least means all minus Noah and his family. So there's some wiggle room there. Since there is that wiggle room, we should be even more cautious about asking, and especially cautious about fighting about the details that the Bible doesn't start arguing about there. Now, can we assume that God accomplishes what he sets out to accomplish? Yeah. The God in the Bible says he's going to wipe out humanity and judge humanity in general. So we can assume that that's what he does, because otherwise God would be misleading us, and I don't think he does. So he judges all of humanity there and resets them back down to Noah's family. But beyond that, can we ask ourselves and ponder and have fun and asking about weird things? Let's have fun talking about weird stuff. Be like questions like, are there dinosaurs on the ark? You know what? Let's find out. But let's not argue with each other about it either and call somebody a heretic over the things the Bible doesn't talk about there. We don't fight over that. There's other questions, people will actually argue about this and fight over this. How do the windows of heaven work? In case you don't know, that's one of the 3 sources of water in the account, because we didn't read it all, but there are 3 sources of water. There's the fountains of the deep, there's rain, and there's the windows of heaven. How do those work? I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, so I'm not going to argue with you over it, because I'm going to assume it's supernatural, because it uses the word heaven. That's a clue there with that. All right. It's also fair, to ask questions like, where'd all the water come from, which proves to us something unique is happening. Because did you know, let's say, well, the Bible says all the mountains were covered at one point in the story, so I'm going to go with that, which means it's 15 cubits over the top of Mount Everest, which means we need about triple the amount of water that we have on the entire planet Earth. Where did it come from? God. That's the only answer we have, right? And that's an okay answer. I don't know, or a miracle. But once you say a miracle to add the water and take away the water, now you're admitting that scientists who want to argue about this, you're not talking on the same wavelength anymore, because they're wanting to work in a natural worldview, and you're saying, I'm okay with the supernatural worldview. So if you try to talk about it, you're going to do this and not communicate on the same page. That's okay. We're speaking 2 different languages, and now there's no reason to fight each other, because you have to figure out how to communicate before you escalate the communication. So a miracle is definitely involved if God's flooding the entire earth. And so we don't need to look for natural explanations of supernatural events. So of course it's going to get weird and messy if we want to talk about it and fight about it. The Bible doesn't need to answer, well, how did that happen when the miraculous gets involved? There is already a cultural understanding of how this happened, that the fact that it did happen, and the Bible just steps in and says, well, here are some corrections to your problems of how you viewed this kind of thing. And the story is crafted in such a way to tell us what the main point is. And so let's talk about that instead. It would be better than it did it again. What the theological purposes, the divine true storytelling was meant to convey. And when we stop and think why the story is in the Bible, maybe why it's in the book of Genesis at all, we might ask questions like, how does this fit in with God's covenant with Abraham and Israel? That's an important question to ask. How does this fit in with the overall storyline of the entire Bible? That's an important question to ask. And we can actually answer that question pretty easily with this story, right? Because not only does God, during the most cosmic upheaval known to man, he keeps Noah in his thoughts. He makes a covenant with Noah. And this is the first time we ever get the word covenant in the Bible. It's in chapter 6, verse 17 and 18. It says, "For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth will die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you." A covenant is a type of promise. It's more than a promise, though. It could be similar to a contract, but it's more relational than formal. Near the end of the story, God steps in to explain what this particular set of covenant promises mean and what contractual obligations he's making with Noah. That's when the rainbow is brought into the story, but that's in chapter 9, so we'll talk about that next week. So be thankful we're not going down that path. Originally, the sermon was going to go a lot longer. But we have learned, though, enough details for our brains to stop and say, okay, well, let's just work with what we have before we get to chapter 9. So we have learned the ancient peoples believed in a cataclysmic flood, but the Bible corrects some facts. That death was not due to annoyance or like a war amongst the gods, something like that. Salvation wasn't because of heroism or some great act of this really cool superhuman. God wasn't tricked. He wasn't scared. God is just and righteous, and he must therefore act when the balance for evil has tipped the scales. And he does step in and act, and we see him willing to do it on a grand scale here. The theological point is that universal corruption brings universal condemnation. And yet, even when there is condemnation, God remembers, which is a way of saying God thinks about and he acts upon. He remembers the fact that he is also a God of grace. Because we've also learned the center point of the story is that God remembers Noah. We don't have details about how Noah was like this super cool guy or super gifted or special or amazing. We'll see that one of his first acts off the boat is not so great in some ways. But we do learn that God remembers those who walk alongside of him. That's really the main thing we have about Noah, is that he's willing to walk with God. And we learn from the rest of the Bible what that means is you're just making an attempt. Even if you're not perfect at it, you just make an attempt to walk alongside of God and walk like him. It's not about how gifted or how powerful you are. Noah was not a king. He was not a conqueror. He was just a guy married to his wife, and he had a few kids. That's all we know about him. That's it. You can be just a regular, average Joe kind of person too. God can remember you. The important question is, do you walk with him? The flood narrative demonstrates that God is a God who's got the whole world in his hands, and we could start singing right now. We don't need to. He doesn't give up on his promises, and even when he approaches us as a judge, he is still willing to show grace. But if you reject his grace and live the kind of life that tells God you will not try to walk with him, and if you do show me grace right now, what I'm going to do immediately after that is just go try and punch you right in the face again, would a good judge let that person go free? Is there a different kind of walk or a different kind of lifestyle that you need to try to start? Baptism, as we mentioned, it's a first step. It's symbolized in this story. You can be saved through the waters of judgment by dying to your old self, pledging to God to live in a new self and wanting a new kind of walk and gait with your whole lifestyle. But your life, maybe not a perfect life, but a life that wants to walk like God and try, that's the next steps too, and those steps last forever. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we are thankful that there is a story that is so simple, it's included in every kid's book, but also so complicated, every kid's Bible, that it's also so complicated that it can take way too long of a sermon to not even cover all the details.